Ben Pierce from the Rosa Tracker, and today I want to talk to you guys about the awesome rocket company known as Rocket Lab. Rocket Lab has been around since 2006, actually, in some form or another, although they only really started to become serious maybe around 2013. They currently launched the Electron rocket, which is a small rocket that has actually been very successful. And they're a really, really fascinating company that is worth studying into more. And quite frankly, they're following the footsteps of SpaceX, and I expect to see them do some great and mighty things here at some point in time in the future. They launched their Electron rocket for the first time about 4 years ago, almost exactly actually. And with a couple of incidences, the first launch failed due to some ground support equipment failure during the launch, which led them to have to self-destruct the rocket to meet the range safety violations. And they had one other rocket launch that also failed. But they've had a pretty good track record, and I think they're on 15 or 16 so far successful launches, which is really, really amazing for a new company to be able to do. But what Rocket Lab is really succeeding in is just incredible. The one thing that they do better than any other rocket company out there, I think, is they're surveying the market. They have this laser focus. We're not going to try to take 100% of the market. We're going to try to be the best provider for 80% of the market and go from there. And that's what they did with the Electron rocket. The Electron rocket, they sized it to be able to take a majority of payloads. And I think its payload capacity now is 300 kilograms, I think. I think they sized it originally to carry 200, and they've been able to gain some improvements as they've moved along. And the reason they did that is whatever mass they chose could launch a significant portion of the small satellites that were out there. If they went another 100 kilograms bigger, they'd only capture a very small percentage more of the market, and so therefore that's all they really needed. Their idea was, let's be the small satellite launcher. Now, if you have a big giant rocket, then you're paying for it regardless if you send a little tiny payload or you fill the thing to capacity. And usually these smaller secondary payloads, they didn't want to spend $60 million or $100 million just to launch their little tiny rocket. So they would be a part of what's called a rideshare. That's where you group a bunch of satellites together and you launch them all together. They split the costs, but there's a lot of problems with those kinds of rideshares. The biggest problem is that you're subject to all of the other payloads. If you're the primary payload, you pay for a little bit extra, then you have a little bit more launch security, but you still have to depend on everyone else getting together, and building stuff to launch into space is hard. Getting the coordination between so many different companies is basically impossible. So you may have your payload waiting on the ground for 3 years while it could be up there making money, or you could be, forced to give up your launch because the primary payload decided to go without you, and then you're up the creek without a paddle. And yeah, that just kind of stuff is not so great. So Rocket Lab positioned itself to be the dedicated launcher. They can do a more gentle launch because it's a smaller rocket. Their rocket is much more gentle for these small payloads. Won't be shaken around as much. They can launch it into exactly the orbit that the spacecraft wants to go into. That way they don't have to settle with maybe being in the wrong phase, which may take them months to be able to correct that on an orbit, not to mention a fair amount of fuel. And overall, it's a really neat concept. Now, SpaceX did something similar with the Falcon 1, although I don't think they did the market research. They were just trying to build a rocket and carry some small payload. They didn't really have, I think, a size in mind to do that. And so they really weren't that successful. They built the rocket and there just wasn't a market at that point in time for small satellites. So they gave that up to go with the Falcon 9 rocket, which is, quite frankly, been able to do some pretty amazing things. Now, however, Rocket Lab is starting to change the game. They're learning how to recover their booster stages, similar to how SpaceX does, although they're able to do this with a parachute because they're using a much smaller rocket. So it's a much, much simpler system than SpaceX's system that requires a number of burns and a ship and all kinds of crazy stuff to be able to come back. So far, they've recovered a booster, although they have yet to refly one. The recovered booster landed in the ocean. It was never going to be reflown. They may refly some parts from it though, just to see how things work. But most importantly, they learned what they needed to make it reusable completely. They also have learned that a lot of these companies, they don't want to build the entire satellite. They just want to have some nifty payload. So they realized that, hey, this kick stage that we have that's really just used to circularize the orbit, it has pretty much everything it needs except for power and the payload to be able to be a satellite. And so they just stuck some solar panels on it. And now they have a satellite bus that they can sell to other customers potentially and do some pretty neat things. And this is a really cool thing. The Electron rocket also is the only rocket in the world to be completely carbon composite in its body, which reduces the weight significantly. And it also uses electrical engines, which have some really neat efficiencies that it's able to do. Overall, this is a really, really neat rocket. And it's probably overlooked a little bit by some of the bigger fans out there. But now they're starting to do something really interesting. They've started to realize, hey, for the most part, they're going to be huge constellations of satellites. Having just one satellite up in space usually doesn't do a lot of good. What you really want is a network of these satellites that are working together to achieve some kind of common goal. One of the constellations that they have done a lot of launching with is the Planet Lab, which are these Earth imaging satellites. They can go and look and see the entire globe and see it update. They can image the entire globe in pretty high resolution every day, which is pretty neat. And they're doing quite well with this overall. But they want to be able to do this. And if you look at the SpaceX launches, especially in the early days, a significant portion of those were satellites like Orbcomm and Iridium, and currently they're Starlink satellites, where they're launching a whole bunch of satellites with the same design into the same orbit to form these constellations. So they said, hey, let's build a rocket that has that as its end goal. And so we're going to build a constellation launching rocket. They realized that about half of the capacity in a Falcon 9 is just completely unused. So they're designing their rocket to be able to carry the majority of the payloads. It can carry something like 80% of the payloads that a Falcon 9 can carry. And it's going to be able to do it for cheaper, probably $40 million. That's just a guess, by the way, but it should definitely be cheaper than SpaceX's $50 million for the Falcon 9. And that's going to attract a lot of people. It'll probably be a more gentle ride, and it's overall a really enticing prospect. They're building this in the Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport Mars, which is located on Wallops Island, Virginia, a couple of hours from Washington, D.C. It's a not very heavily used spaceport for orbital rockets. They do use a number of sounding rockets that are suborbital that are launched from there. But it does launch occasional missions. It launched one to the moon on a Minotaur rocket, the Ladi mission, which also launched a frog, poor guy. It frequently launches the Antares rocket to the International Space Station. In fact, I was lucky enough to be able to see that. That was the very first orbital rocket launch that I ever saw. Very neat thing. Now, Rocket Lab is currently building out their Launch Complex 2 there, but they're not going to launch this from Launch Complex 2, and they're not going to build a new launch pad. They're actually going to use the Antares launch pad that is right there. The two launch pads share some of the infrastructure, although they are distinct launch pads. They share like a water tower and a few things like that. But they're actually going to launch this from the same launch pad as Antares, which is kind of interesting. I've never actually heard of two rockets that have shared the same launch pad at the same time. They'll usually refurbish them, but they could theoretically do that. The fuel will be the same, which is RP-1 and liquid oxygen, although the Antares rocket upper stage is a solid rocket, so they're not going to be able to take that kind of synergy into effect. But it should be pretty neat, and it will be a little bit higher capacity than the Antares rocket. The Antares rocket has really only ever launched stuff to the space station and launches the Cygnus spacecraft, which is 6,600 kilograms. But this rocket, the Neutron rocket, will be able to carry 8,000 kilograms, so just a little bit more. And there's some speculation, actually, that they may try to convince Northrop Grumman to launch with this instead of their own semi-developed rocket. You see, Northrop Grumman currently purchases a bunch of different parts from different people, puts it together, calls the rocket the Antares rocket, and from there it will launch into space. But it's not really something that they design themselves. So maybe this will even carry stuff there. It could theoretically carry humans, although it's not really that high a capacity. It would be enough to carry a Soyuz spacecraft, though, which is kind of interesting. And some of the early Mercury and I believe Gemini could also fit on there. It is entirely possible to do some pretty neat things. Now, carrying humans is not their goal. Their goal is specifically to build a rocket that's designed to carry these constellations of satellites that are up there that have been continued to launch. And I'm not entirely sure who their customers are going to be. It turns out that Mars is a really great spot to launch stuff to see the United States. The inclination of the space station is really great to get the northern part of the United States so you can cover it all pretty well. But it's not very good for the poles. You can't launch a polar satellite from there. And a lot of communication satellites do prefer that. But I'm sure they've done their research, and it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of this. So, of all of the rocket companies that are out there in the world, ULA, Blue Origin, Astra, Virgin Orbital, Rocket Lab, I think, is the one that is really giving SpaceX a run for their money. They have a proven track record. They obviously have a CEO in Peter Beck that is very focused on making stuff happen. And yeah, he's made some bad predictions and ended up having to eat his hat because of it. But mark my words, SpaceX needs to watch out. This little company, Rocket Lab, is really going to start shaking the marketplace. And I think that SpaceX is going to start losing a significant portion of their spacecraft travel in this little rocket company. Although when Starship launches, who knows what's going to happen. But as we know, Starship is definitely a little bit explodey these days. Hopefully they can get all their issues fixed out, and if Starship is able to meet its promise, then maybe Rocket Lab will be having to live off of their hats instead of just seeing them as more of a joke. Thank you guys so much for everything. Let me know whatever questions or comments you guys have. Let me know what you think, if you think that Rocket Lab is really the biggest competition, or if there's some other rocket company that you think is in a better position. Thank you to my Patreons and Discord members for all of your help that you guys provide. I couldn't do this without you. And for everyone who watches, likes, and subscribes to this video, you guys are amazing. Thanks for everything, and until next time, keep on trekking. Take care, guys.